Check, check. You guys hear okay? All right, it's 1 o'clock, so welcome to this. Okay, no, don't get too close. How's this one? Hello? Okay. So thank you for coming to the Storm's 9th Storm Seminar Series. First, the emergency. How's this? Okay. So for emergencies, in case of emergencies, please exit out this back door to the left, down the stairways. We meet in Cesar Chavez Park, which is that way. And restrooms are out these doors in the hallways. Ladies is over here, and the men's is down the hall over on this side. This presentation will be recorded and posted after at the waterboards.ca.gov/storms. If you do have questions for Andy during the presentation, please email them to storms@waterboards.ca.gov. And so, let's see. So Dr. Fisher is here today. He is a professor at UC Santa Cruz and director of UC Water, as well as the founder of the Recharge Initiative, which is a focused effort to protect, enhance, and improve the availability and reliability of groundwater resources. He focuses on stormwater capture and recharge, including development of a metered recharge pilot project in the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. He looks at stormwater quality and at using GIS to map ideal locations for groundwater infiltration. So please help me welcome Andy Fisher. Thank you very much. It's been an interesting day so far. We've had a lot of good discussion, and I thank you guys for taking time out of your schedules to be here. I'm going to blast through about 5 different topics that are kind of connected and interrelated pertaining to stormwater collection for aquifer recharge. And I'll just note that a lot of this work was done by students or former students who are identified here by having their names underlined, and you'll see their names popping up periodically during the presentation. But within California, there are really 3 distinct and compounding threats to groundwater. Of course, increasing demand as our population grows and there's more productivity on farms, but also shifting land use and increasing the intensity of rainfall. This is something that's seen in the hydrologic record. It's not a modeling prediction. It's actually occurring right now. And both of these last 2 issues lead to a reduction in groundwater recharge, simply because there is less opportunity for water that hits the landscape to infiltrate before it runs off. So the Recharge Initiative has a number of components, and I'm going to go through just some short examples of each, and then hopefully during questions we can expand on topics that may be of interest. If you have questions about specific topics and want papers or other documentation, please contact me, and I'll be happy to provide those. So the 4 main overall topics involve mapping, modeling, measuring, and then ultimately monetizing or incentivizing groundwater recharge. The area where I live here in northern end of Monterey Bay is in California's Central Coast. And this is a part of the state that uses more groundwater as a fraction of what satisfies freshwater demand than any other part of the state. This diagram on the right from a water plan update shows water use in thousands of acre feet on the top of these little fractions, but the bottom is the percent satisfied by groundwater. So other parts of the state use more groundwater than the Central Coast, but they're at sort of a third or a quarter or a half of the total supply. Central Coast region, it's about 85%. The other thing that's a big challenge for the Central Coast region is that we're completely separated from the big water transfers that shuttle large amounts of water all around the rest of the state, shown in this diagram from Jeff Mount's book. So as a result, we really have to figure out a way to generate enough water to provide for needs in that region without thinking about bringing in water from elsewhere. There's a couple of forms of managed recharge that you might be familiar with. Picture on the left here shows low impact development in the form of a vegetated swale. These are often small-scale systems that are set up very close to the source of runoff. On the right-hand side, you see the large-scale spreading grounds for Orange County. There's a similar system near us for Santa Clara Valley that also infiltrates large amounts of water. Typically, low-impact development sites are built to put on the order of an acre-foot or 10 acre-feet a year into the ground, and these big regional spreading grounds are sort of 10,000 to 100,000 acre-feet per year. But the area that we're really focused on is the space in between, what we call distributed stormwater collection, leading to managed aquifer recharge. And the ultimate goal is to get something that's on the order of 100 to 1,000 acre-feet per year per project site into the ground. I'll give you an example, and this is from the Pajaro Valley groundwater basin shown here in orange. It's in central coastal California, about 2.5 hours south of here. Virtually all the freshwater supply in this basin is groundwater, and it's an agriculturally developed basin that produces a lot of high-value crops like strawberries and caneberries. If Pajaro Valley were a county, it would be the smallest in California by far, but it would be number 5 in farm income. The area has its water managed by the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency, a special act district that was set up in the 1980s to address groundwater overdraft, which at that time was well understood to be on the order of tens of thousands of acre-feet per year. Because the amount of water that's pumped from the ground, in addition to losses to the ocean, exceeds what flows into the aquifer, this aquifer is in overdraft. And the exact amount of overdraft is not clear. It's on the order of 10 to 15,000 acre-feet per year. It's about 20 to 30% of what's pumped in the basin. And as a result, seawater is moving in along the coast. The area that's shown in red is from a few years ago, but it indicates an area where there's significant seawater intrusion to the point where that water in the ground cannot be used to grow most crops that are of interest, and it can't be used for human consumption either. So I'll show you one site where we've been working for a few years, and it's sort of in the back of the basin, adjacent to the Pajaro River, and this photograph shows the site. It's about 170 acres on a working ranch. The drainage area is marked in tan. Water flows across the landscape and through ditches, flows into a sediment settling basin, and then continues on its way, and eventually into a 4-acre infiltration basin where it's allowed to percolate into the ground. The goal of this project was to get about 100 acre-feet per year into the ground. Here's the same diagram you saw before. If you stand up at this end of the basin and look to the southwest, this is what you'll see when it's empty. And then here's what you'll see when it's full, if you stand right over here and look in. We instrumented the site with a number of different tools, including a real-time system shown here, and that allows us to collect and view data remotely. It allows the landowner, the grower, other stakeholders in the region to see what's going on at the field site. We looked at a variety of factors here as the system was operating. So here's a summary of some of the data. This is annual precipitation for 3 different water years. You guys know water years. They start in October and they end in September. And this shows the amount of infiltration that we calculate by doing a mass balance on the basin. You may be interested in this axis. It shows the infiltration in acre-feet per year. And here's our project goal of 100 acre-feet per year. And the first 3 years of the project were the first 3 years of the drought. And so my student, Sarah Baganskis, wondered if she would get her degree or not. But the good news was that things got better for the next couple years. Actually, 2015 was still part of the drought. This is mean precip in the area, and so we're still below the mean. But in fact, during this season, most of the rain that year, in December, you might remember, December 14, it fell during 1 week. And in fact, during that week, most of the rain fell in one afternoon. And as a result of the intensity of that storm, even during the drought, we happened to hit our project target. Right? So this was really the epiphany that said, this is what we need in a world where rainfall is becoming increasingly intense. More of it is falling during a short period of time. Water year 2016 was even better, about the same amount of recharge or infiltration rather occurred, but much higher rainfall. The difference here is important, and it has to do with the distribution of rain during the year, how intense the storms were and how widely separated they are. It's kind of another topic. This last year was something different entirely. Of course, this was an El Nino year. This was not, but we definitely got a lot more rain. But again, the rain was kind of spread out throughout the year, and so we didn't get a proportionately equivalent amount of recharge. But out of the 6 years of monitoring, we have 3 that met our project goal, and of course 3 where the rainfall and runoff was quite low. So that's an example of a DSC-MAR project. And now we'd like to figure out how to site these across the landscape. And the challenge is that groundwater recharge conditions are highly variable place to place within our basin, but also around the state. So we undertook a project in collaboration with the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, and this was to identify sites where distributed stormwater collection could lead to managed aquifer recharge. And the study region is all of Santa Cruz County and the northern part of Monterey County and a little bit of San Benito that's hidden by that window. And the general concept of the mapping work is to bring different data sets into a geographic information system, or GIS, and then co-register them and overlay them to see where the different conditions correspond. So for example, if you have 2 properties, a higher value here and a lower value there, and then a higher value here and a lower value there, and you put these on top of each other, you'd find the place where the high values overlap to be ideal. So that's the general concept, using a GIS to combine data sets. I'll just show you a couple of quick examples. This is a soils database for the study region, and it includes more than 5,000 little soil shape polygons. These have been mapped out by researchers and growers and folks in Ag Extension and the Soil Conservation Service, and then put into a database that's publicly available. When we look at the region, we then calculate for every little polygon of soil the infiltration capacity. That is the ease with which water will flow vertically through the soil. And this shows a cumulative plot of those values from essentially 0 all the way up to 16 meters per day. So quite a range in soil properties. We categorize those on a log scale, and we get this map. The areas in blue have relatively high infiltration capacity, and the areas in sort of the pink orange have low infiltration capacity. So this is the approach we take. We gather data, classify it, and then start to combine it. In the case of Pajaro Valley down here, these big areas in red, these tend to be floodplains or wetlands. So those are places with hydrophobic soils, and water does not infiltrate very easily. There's over 100 different geological units that have been mapped in the area. Here's the geological map, and then we classify them as to whether they are or are not an aquifer. And so here's the categorization map. So things in green are primary aquifers, things in pink are definitely not an aquifer, and these are in between. So some may be an aquifer in some place, but not in others, or the light green, these are secondary aquifers that aren't heavily used in that particular part of the region. So combine the first 2 data sets and we get our initial surface map of managed aquifer recharge suitability. Areas that are in the greener colors are highly suitable, tans are moderately suitable, and then the pinks and reds are low suitability. I just show here the distribution, higher values here, lower values. About 40% of the area is moderately to highly suitable based on these surface conditions. It does vary by basin. There's actually 4 different groundwater basins in this study region. In fact, the surface data is not quite enough. We need to look in the subsurface as well. And I'll just show you briefly a cross-section through this part of the study area going from Santa Cruz County down into Monterey County. And this is a geological cross-section showing the Santa Margarita groundwater basin, the Soquel-Aptos groundwater basin, and then the Pajaro Valley groundwater basin, where I'm going to focus a lot of the talk. I put this slide in to really make the point that especially in California, the variability is just extreme from one place to another. These are just a few miles apart, but they're a completely different geology. And water that falls in the Santa Margarita basin is not going to go into Soquel-Aptos or Pajaro Valley. It's pretty much stuck in that basin, or it's going to flow out to streams or to the ocean. And each one has different requirements, different geology, different land use, and all that needs to be taken into account in siting groundwater projects. What we do is take subsurface data from groundwater models and compile it and assess 4 other characteristics of the aquifers. I won't go into the details of what these mean, but essentially it's a measure of the ease with which water can flow through the aquifers. That includes their thickness. It includes the ability of the aquifers to store water, including whether or not water levels have gone up or down with time. Areas in the basins where groundwater levels have gone down, that indicates they have space where they can potentially receive infiltrating water. And the thickness of the soil zone is important because if it's too thin, you don't get enough treatment benefit as the water flows through. But if they're too thick, then you lose confidence that the water you infiltrate will actually reach an aquifer. So we try to find a sweet spot. When we combine the 4 data sets, we generate a subsurface map like this on the same scale, higher suitability in green, lower suitability in orange. Now add these 2 maps together, and here's the final map. This is a composite MAR suitability map, including 6 different data sets, surface data plus the subsurface data. So it turns out that these sites can give you a good sense of where you could put water in the ground, but they don't tell you whether there is water available to put in the ground. And to look at that problem, we run a rainfall runoff model, the Precipitation Runoff Modeling System, or PRMS. This is an open source program that was designed and built and is maintained by the US Geological Survey. It's a watershed scale model that lets us route water across the landscape, and it's got a pretty big user group. This diagram on the right here kind of shows you the different reservoirs and flows that are represented by the mathematical model. So we have to come up with a bunch of data sets to represent the properties of the plants, the soil zone, the groundwater, and then input these into the computer and then rain on the landscape in the computer. So the way this is done is shown for the Pajaro Valley groundwater basin here. It's divided up into a series of little polygons that are known as hydrologic response units, or HRUs. You can think of them as just little places on the landscape with similar properties. And they're defined based on the topography, but then also based on things like land use and vegetation. For application to PRMS, the gridding of the model into such fine cells is a little bit unusual. People use PRMS to model the entire Mississippi drainage basin, for example, or to model entire continents. So we're looking at areas that have properties on the basis of around 25 to 250 acres, little postage stamps. But these are about the size of individual stormwater collection systems, so it fits well within our goal for the project. Having identified the different HRUs, we now have to populate them with more than 80 data sets for all the different properties that characterize those regions. They include things like the vegetation density, the percent of the shallow soil that's made of sand, and then the percent impervious area, the presence of concrete or roads or other structures. So this just shows some examples for the same area. You can see here, this is the city of Watsonville, lots of concrete, not much vegetation. These areas are dune sand, so they're rich in sand and so forth. Now we need to rain on the landscape in order to generate runoff with the model. And for this, we adapted a novel approach. The typical approach folks would take is to take output from a climate model and apply wetter periods, dry periods, and make a projection. What we decided to do instead was to use the historic record from 1981 to 2014, which is available in this PRISM data set at an 800-meter grid spacing. So a very, very fine grid spacing showing, for example, on this one day, January 10th, 2003, almost 6 centimeters of rain here in the northern end of the Pajaro Valley groundwater basin and about 2 centimeters on the southern end. And this kind of granularity of variability in rainfall day by day and temperature is important for representing, for example, the pathway that storms take as they move through the region. Without putting too fine a point of it, I just want to do a quick comparison with climate data. Here's a result from a recent USGS analysis of climate models for California. This line shows no projected change in precipitation. Half the models say it's going to be wetter, half the models say it's going to be drier. Which one do you want to use? Right? One approach climate modelers take is just to average everything together, and then you get almost no change. Right? And the same with temperature. They all say warmer world, but some say 5 degrees, some say 2 degrees. Which one do you want to use? So we decided to avoid this ambiguity entirely and create a catalog from the historic record. Run simulations with current day conditions, drier conditions, wetter conditions, and see what the result looks like. Here's the other challenge with regional climate models. This is a 20-kilometer grid, which is pretty much the state of the art for regional climate models. So if we use the output from climate models, we'd be assigning one set of rainfall to this entire area and then one set to this entire area. Again, missing out on all the detail that actually occurs in the observational record. So the approach that we took was to collect all that observational data and then assemble a catalog. We plotted total annual precipitation here, just cumulative values. So here's all the values from the record for each year. And then we selected 5 dry years, 7 normal years, and 5 wet years. And what we do is we string these together in a future scenario which has wet periods and dry periods. Because at the end of the day, we don't know what the climate's going to be 50 years from now. What we know is some years will be wetter and some years will be drier, and we need to be ready for all of the above. So here's just some of the results from the climate modeling. This is a dry simulation, a normal simulation, and a wet simulation. And what's shown here is just arranged as months of precipitation. So this is a 5-year period, so it's 60 months. Okay, so 5 years, 5 years, 5 years. And the bars indicate the amount of rainfall, between 16 inches a year and up to 32 inches per year in this area. And they all have years, even the dry years, have the occasional months with significant rainfall, just like we saw at our field site. Here's the runoff that's predicted from the flow model. Now, there's a lot less runoff during the dry years, not surprisingly. But again, each year typically has 1 or 2 months when there is some runoff. And the thing to realize is that it only takes an inch of runoff from the basin to generate a significant resource. So we're probably not going to be able to infiltrate a lot of extra stormwater runoff during dry years, but there'll be some. In addition, during the normal and the wet years, there's a lot more persistence in the runoff. That is, you're much more likely to get a wet month after a wet month after a wet month. And that really compounds the effects of stormwater generation and opportunities to infiltrate groundwater. Here's the same data, but now presented spatially. Dry conditions, normal conditions, and wet. Here's the rainfall, and it's interesting, they have the same pattern, higher to the north, lower to the south, but you can see the colors get darker because during the wet years, you get up to 60 inches of rain in the southern Santa Cruz Mountains. But this is the runoff generation. And you'll notice there are large areas in pink here with relatively little runoff along the coast because of the dunes. There are also areas, even during dry years, that generate a lot of runoff. Okay, and that's that area I showed before, the city of Watsonville. This area in the dunes to the south only gets runoff during wet years. During the dry years, there's not much, although there are individual polygons in here, which might be good places to collect a little bit of runoff. So the variability is really important. There's not going to be one project that's going to work all over the basin. We've got to pick our sites carefully. So why this variability? Well, it's the same properties I showed you before, plus 77 others, right? The amount of vegetation, the amount of impervious area, and the amount of sand. And these map very nicely. Here's a lot of runoff being generated in downtown Watsonville because of all the concrete. So what's nice about the modeling is it tells you something that might be somewhat intuitive, but it allows us to hang numbers on that. It allows us to make predictions and say, here's how much more runoff we think we're going to generate during a wet year, for example, than during a dry year. Of course, what we want to do is combine the maps and the models. We want to take our MAR suitability map and combine it with the runoff map. And that's what we're in the process of doing, along with regional partners, the counties, municipalities, and local water agencies. At present, we're helping out with 2 groundwater recharge projects, one here near the coast that Pajaro Valley Water runs. The one I showed you earlier is the yellow dot right here. These are currently active, as in they were active last winter. They'll hopefully be active next winter. And we have 3 more that are in development that are supposed to be constructed this year. A large one here that I'll show you in a moment, and then two smaller ones as well. This is one of the new projects. It's on a working ranch. The area that's drained is over 1,300 acres. And the landowner has allocated about 15 acres in this parcel, around 7 of which are going to get developed with a big sediment collection system and then an infiltration system as well. And this project was proposed by us in the RCD and Pajaro Valley Water, and it was just approved a couple of weeks ago by the State Coastal Conservancy. So this should go in later this week. So it was quite a process. There's identifying sites, there's field studies with drilling to figure out if the conditions are right. There's cooperation of the landowner. In this case, the landowner didn't want to sign a contract for using IRWIN funding early on for the initial site investigation because he wanted to maintain control over that information. He actually paid $40,000 himself for the initial studies to get the project going. But then we brought more money to bear through this Coastal Conservancy grant. We ran field tests in 16. I'll show you some results from that to look at improvements to water quality, and the construction is all set to begin here. So one of the questions we've often had is, what about water quality? What's going to happen with all these sites and with stormwater runoff going into the ground? So we're interested in that. And at another site that we investigated about 10 years ago, we found a significant load reduction simply with water percolating through shallow soil, if the conditions are right. But what we were interested in is, can we enhance the ability to remove nutrients, to remove nitrate, for example, through modification of the soil substrate? And the approach we're taking is to investigate the addition of what's called a permeable reactive barrier, or PRB. This is a figure from a groundwater study. These have been used as vertical walls where water with some solutes or contaminants in it flows through, and then it gets cleaned up by the time it comes out the other end. It's just driven by natural flow in the aquifer. Typically, these walls might be on the order of a foot thick or 2 feet thick and filled with materials like a carbon source or chunks of iron or another material that's needed to treat the water. So our idea was to turn this on its side and to put a PRB as part of a recharge basin and see whether we could get some kind of water quality improvement, and what the operational effort would be, and especially once we scale up, how hard is it going to be to put one of these in and maintain it, if indeed it's worthwhile. So these are unpublished results, but I just thought you might like to see some of the data that we're collecting. We set up an experimental plot. It's kind of a meter scale, and we instrument the heck out of it. We put in temperature probes to measure the flow rate and pressure gauges and fluid samplers at multiple depths. We drive water into the ground as we pour the water into the system. And I've got a little video, time-lapse video here that shows the system in operation. So these are photos taken once a minute. This is a sandy soil, and you can see the water going up and down. This little float switch here turns the water supply on and off. We're using ambient groundwater and percolating it onto the ground, and the water is rich in nitrate. It has about 20 to 30 milligrams per liter nitrate nitrogen, so 2 to 3 times the drinking water standard. And this little record shows that water going up and down and up and down. Here's a 24-hour period. You can see the little sawtooth pattern. Each one of these little sawtooth data sets is an infiltration test. But we run the test for 2 weeks. And the reason we do that is to mimic the conditions that would occur during the rainy season, when one of these systems would get wet and stay wet for a while. Okay. This shows where we changed the water level in the plot, and so we slowed it down. We did it fast at first to really drive the water in, and then we slowed it down a little bit. Okay. There's a lot of data. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. There's 3 plots, 2 with a permeable reactive barrier and 1 with native soil. That's the pink. And these are bulk infiltration rates as indicated by the solid dots. The first thing you'll notice is a big difference in rates, although they're all pretty high. These are in meters per day. So this plot, we saw 20 meters per day of infiltration. It's a very sandy soil. It's made of dune sand in this case. The difference between the plots, that's just natural variability. It has nothing to do with our testing. It's just when you go out to a field and you pick 3 spots in the ground, they are not going to be the same. They're all going to be a little bit different. Okay? The ones in blue and green have a permeable reactive barrier, this time made of redwood chips. That's what we tested. We've also tested with biochar, but I'm going to tell you about the redwood chips here. Okay? And these tests lasted 2 weeks. Our temperature probes, which measure the vertical infiltration rate, they provide this data shown with the open circles. And it's on the order of 1/10 of the total rate. So much of the water going in through the perk systems is turning and flowing sideways once it gets into the soil. Only about 10% actually flows vertically. So measuring the vertical rate is very important if you want to understand how a system that's 4 or 5 acres in size is going to infiltrate. It's mainly going to be vertical. Okay? This diagram shows nitrate concentrations as a function of depth. And the top plot shows native soil, and the bottom plot shows one of the plots that had the permeable reactive barrier made of wood chips. And it's about 1 foot of wood chips at the top of the soil. And I want you to particularly notice this time period when the infiltration rates were relatively low, and we get a significant and repeatable decrease in nitrate concentration with depth in the system. I'm not going to show you the data, but we have isotope analyses that show that this is denitrification. It's microbes in the subsurface consuming that nitrate as an oxidant and just putting it back into the air as the nitrogen that we breathe. It's removing it from the hydrologic system. What's interesting about this is that we tested up to very high infiltration rates, again, showing vertical rates that are on the order of up to 2 meters a day. Earlier studies in this area showed that there was a limit. And when we got above about 0.9 meters a day, we had no more nitrate removal. With the addition of the PRB, we've increased the infiltration rates as if we get at which we get significant nitrogen cycling. In other words, we can have water flowing in faster and still remove nitrate by adding the permeable reactive barrier. So it's expanding the envelope of conditions across which we can actually improve the water quality during infiltration. And as an example of this, you can't quite see the right-hand side. This is kind of a cartoon of a full-sized managed recharge percolation basin with a cartoon of a PRB shown here. In an earlier study, we showed 600 kilograms of nitrate removed from an annual operation of a system that's about 4 acres in size. And based on the calculations I just showed you, we'd get more than twice as much nitrate removed if that had been lined with wood chips. Okay. And in part, it's because it's at the higher rates of infiltration that this makes the system more effective at denitrifying. Okay, so it compounds the effects. You're getting faster infiltration and faster nitrate removal at the same time. We've also begun microbial studies to find out which bugs that live in the soil are actually responsible and whether they're being changed in their populations because of the use of the PRB. And this is just a quick example of some preliminary data. These are different groups of bacteria and what they do for a living. The stars are nitrate fixers, the circles are denitrifiers. Don't worry about the particulars, who's there. This is the native soil before and the native soil after infiltration, okay? And the size of the circle indicates the fraction of the microbes in the soil who are present. This is the PRB before infiltration, so they all look very much the same. This is the PRB after. And so our hypothesis was that we would see a significant shift in the microbial population. And now, using tools in modern genetics, we can actually test that. This was work with DNA, which tells what's present, but it doesn't prove they're active. We have work underway right now with RNA. And RNA is ephemeral. It goes away if it's not being generated. And we've captured environmental samples in the field and got them right into liquid nitrogen. They're being analyzed now. So we can figure out which genes were active, which microbes were using those to accomplish denitrification as a result of this process. And I think this is an important part of figuring out where this will work and where it might not work. So that work is underway. The last part here, before we wrap up, has to do with incentives. Putting these systems in actually requires a commitment from a lot of different groups, including landowners and tenants. And this illustrates one of the problems. This is an infiltration system which collects a crust of fine-grained material, typically, which is carried in with the flowing water. And in this case, on a farmed landscape, it's sediment that's flowing in from the surrounding hillsides. And every year, the agency goes into this site and they scrape it out. Here's part of it that's been scraped, here's part that hasn't. So there's a maintenance cost with operating these systems. So how can people be encouraged to put systems like this in if they're going to be taking on a cost? Well, there's a model. The model is called net energy metering, and it was developed and implemented by PG&E. And the concept is that if you have solar panels on your house and you generate electricity that's more than you need, you can put that power back onto the grid and your power meter would run backwards. The biggest loss with the use of the smart meters is we no longer get to watch the wheel run backwards, okay, if you have a net metering program. So what does it require? Well, you've got to be able to measure and account for what you're getting credit for. There needs to be a formula, and everybody has to trust each other, right? So we've been working on developing a pilot program based on this idea in the Pajaro Valley. And I'll just spin a scenario for you to show how it could work. Imagine 75 acres and you're growing tasty berries, so you need 2.5 feet of water. That's around 190 acre-feet per year. In this area, precip averages 18 inches, and let's assume during the big events we get a runoff of 40% of that. And that's about right, actually, for this area, based on our field measurements. Imagine that you have different drainage areas flowing into different infiltration areas, and I've just assumed for the sake of argument the infiltration area is 1% of the drainage area. In this region, landowners and growers, they pay for water, and they pay about $200 an acre foot. Okay, so that's a fee that they're already paying for the privilege of pumping groundwater. Now let's assume that the net metering program provides a rebate at a level of 50% of the net infiltration that wouldn't have occurred without the project being there. Okay, so here's an example. Here's a grower who doesn't participate and pumps about 190 acre feet of water, right? This grower has drainage from 200 acres that they put into the ground. And in this case, their net infiltration, all right, is the green bar, and therefore the net pumping is the blue bar. They've driven that pumping down to about a third of what it was. If you're draining 400 to 600 acres, in fact, your net pumping is negative. You can't see it here under there, but that means more water is going into the ground than is being extracted. Okay, so they're growing berries and they're making water at the same time. What it means in terms of funding looks something like this. The water cost for this grower is about $38,000 per year. And if they're not participating, they're going to pay all of that. They're going to be writing checks for $38,000 to pump that groundwater. But if they're draining 200 or 400 or 600 acres and collecting that stormwater runoff, then they generate a rebate. And the rebate gets bigger the more water they collect. And by the time you get to 600 acres, in fact, they're not paying a penny at all for water, and they're getting a little bit of money back at the end of the year. So this isn't just a crazy idea. We're actually trying it as a pilot program. It was proposed and approved by Pajaro Valley Water's Board of Directors. And the goal over the 5-year period shown here is to get around 1,000 acre feet per year into the ground through 8 to 10 field projects. There's a third-party certifier, and that's us and the RCD of Santa Cruz County, and we help to identify the sites. We write grant proposals to raise the money to put these in the ground. We sit with the engineers and develop the plans so that we can measure how they work. And that's really important, because if we try to come in later after something's already been built and measure the flows, often it's impossible because water's coming from everywhere. We work with the landowner and tenants to validate the project, which they want us to do, because our validation is what gives them the rebate. And they and the agency have to agree up front to accept our numbers, to not quibble with us about how much water went in the ground. We'll make the measurement, and then we certify it for the landowner and tenant and for the agency. So as of right now, one site's been operational this last year, and there are 3 more that are supposed to go online before the start of the rain in October or November this year. So it's going to be a busy summer, because we've got to build instrument systems and establish a protocol for managing and measuring how these systems work. And we have quite a queue of additional sites. People want to become part of the program. And right now, we're just limited by our own capacity to actually evaluate sites, get them funded, raise the capital, and then actually get them put in. So recharge net metering, or RENM, it's a 3-legged stool. There's 3 kinds of cost: the capital cost to build the systems, the validation or monitoring costs that we're also raising and bringing to the table in terms of grant funding or foundation funding, and then our time, me and my students, and the RCD staff. And then the rebate, which is offered by the agency. And I really need to emphasize, the rebate, it's the smallest of the 3 legs in terms of magnitude, but it really has a big impact. The water agency has agreed that they're going to cut checks this year. They're not just going to put a credit on the bill, they're actually going to send people a check in the mail. And I think this is really going to get people excited about putting water into the ground and connecting with their aquifers. Also, when you do the math on the cost to the agency, this is the cheapest water they're ever going to produce. And all that water that goes into the ground can then be pumped by other customers who then pay full freight with augmentation fees. So it's net revenue positive for the agency. Recharge net metering isn't a bank. And this is really important. We're really trying to incentivize the process of infiltration, not the storage of water. An ancillary benefit is it will put more water into storage, without a doubt. But the focus is simply on getting that water into the ground in the first place. No water right is claimed, so nobody owns it. Because people get the benefit based on putting it into the ground, they're actually not that worried about who's going to pump it out. What they are worried about is whether they can keep their system maintained so they can get the rebate next year by putting more water into the ground. The rebate is performance-based, so that builds in interest among participants in keeping their projects going. And we've said in the program documents, if a project doesn't work, we're going to sunset it and start a new project. We're not going to keep running projects that don't generate a benefit. And the incentive is tied around a rebate of fees. So the agency isn't coming up with money to sort of buy water. What they're doing is allocating part of the funding for their rebate program, which also includes conservation measures as well, but they're allocating part of that to support this RENM program. And I wonder if there might be other ways that groundwater sustainability practices could be incentivized around California. I know Pajaro Valley is a special case in many ways, but I think there are aspects of this that might apply to other parts of the state. That was a lot of information, and we'll have time here in a moment for questions, but I'm just going to wrap up. I think it's widely recognized, I don't have to tell people who are here for a storm seminar that stormwater is a resource. And we know it in this room, but the word is still getting out to others around the state. Stormwater has been historically treated as a nuisance and as a liability. And I think shifting thinking about it as a resource is really important, and it's ongoing work that we'll all have to do to get people on board with the idea of thinking about the benefits of retaining some of that stormwater a little bit longer on the landscape. But to be effective with stormwater infiltration, we need to find the best places to do it, and not all of the landscape is equally viable for projects of this kind. We also need to design and build our systems so that we can actually measure their performance. And this is important, it's a requirement within SGMA that water budgets be developed for basins. And you can't do the budget if you can't measure how much water you're putting in the ground. And so not just for the rebate program, but for the water balance overall, we need to be able to measure how these systems work. We also need to improve water quality with supply, and the technology exists to do that. PRBs are one approach, and there are other approaches that can be used as well. Especially with real-time data systems, I think we can manage these systems so that we do not put water in the ground unless we're ready, unless that water is good enough quality. And I think we're capable of doing that. The concept of the net metering is that groundwater recharge is a hydrologic system service. It provides benefit intrinsically through the process of infiltration and recharge, and that's the win. And by claiming that as the benefit, it simplifies, I think, some of the issues associated with incentivizing recharge, and particularly with groundwater banking, which is a real challenge. So overall, I'd say that managed recharge with stormwater can be part of a portfolio. It's not going to be the silver bullet for the state. It's not going to be the silver bullet for this area either, but I think it can have an impact at the tens of % level in terms of bringing the basin back into balance. And with that, I want to acknowledge a variety of funding sources, all of the people and many others, all the people I listed at the first part of the talk, and many other field hands and helpers we had in the lab. And I thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, please. And we're going to use the microphones just so it all gets recorded and goes out over the web.
Okay. My name is Alberto Ramirez. I work for Tiger Construction Materials. This is regards to bringing stormwater, into a reservoir or, a depression, like a farm depression basin. Have you ever been approached or even give a thought about using the mining pits, the existing mining pits from different companies all across the state of California as a recharge ponds? And one of the things that we have been looking is how we can convert those mining pits that in some cases could be 200 acres by 200 feet in depth into recharge ponds. Or in the wintertime, we always thought about it, in the wintertime when the rivers are running high, and by the law, some of the reservoirs cannot retain the water because it's against the natural process. Somehow that water goes straight, into the ocean. how we can capture that water and bring it into this man-made reservoirs and, recharge or hold the water to whoever claims to be the owner of the water. And our thought, we took it one step further, is that normally those mining pits are in a really good shape, either a square or rectangle. So we were thinking on blanking those mining pits with solar panels, floating solar panels. And that will do two effects. One, help the evaporation and generate power in the case you need to deliver the water to somebody else. So have you ever been thinking about this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we have in northern Santa Cruz County, up in the San Lorenzo Valley, Scotts Valley area, there are sand mines. That water's been, the sand has been collected and trucked over the hill for decades. And indeed, at a couple of the sites, they are being considered for use with managed recharge. In general, I advocate using any pre-existing structure, provided it meets, that all appropriate permits and regulatory requirements are met. So in many cases, the physical conditions at a quarry, especially we're talking about in general, say a sand or gravel quarry, for example, not a quarry that mined, ores, for example, where there'd be acid mine issues, right? We're talking about quarries where it's essentially aggregate for roads or sand or something like that. Absolutely, I think in many cases those are good places. All the other factors will have to be looked at. What are the nearby wells? Is there domestic pumping going on, municipal pumping? What's the travel time? And so forth. In some cases, the owners of those landscapes have been obligated because of past agreements to restore the area. And so in that case, something would have to be sorted out in terms of whether that delays the restoration for this purpose. But we've also, there are other parts of the landscape, from parts of floodplains, dry river channels. There are other places on our landscape where infiltration might be very efficient. And I think we need to look at that. There are trade-offs. And as I mentioned, for example, if your goal is to treat the water and recharge it, then you may want a somewhat slower infiltration rate, right? Maybe 3 meters per day is too fast, and you'd rather have 1 meter per day, which is pretty fast, but then you also get the denitrification benefit, for example. So this is another issue. In many cases, these systems in sand and gravel are going to percolate water very quickly. And that may be good if the water quality is good. If you're taking, river flows of high quality or imported water, and there's a right available to do that. And then the rights is the other issue. And that's been one of the holdups in the Santa Cruz Mountains, is that in this case, it's excess stormwater from the San Lorenzo River, and there's been a debate about whether that would then violate rights of downstream users. I think everybody agrees, though, these are the kinds of projects that should be at least examined, because it can provide an opportunity if the other pieces are in place. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, please.
In regards to the rebate or the
Yes.
net metering program, and your comment about how it at a certain size or it may be financially self-supporting or sustaining, wouldn't that require an influx or an increase in water use at some point? You might meet your basin overdraft at a certain point, but at a certain point more, you'd be importing water at a cost, and you would need more growers taking that extra water. Had you any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really good point that this is not sort of exponential growth with no top, right? At some point you reach the limit, and if nothing else, the limit is runoff from the landscape, right? That's based on this concept. That's the most you could possibly put into the ground, and we do not propose to put every drop of runoff into the ground. We're just trying to get a piece of it. I think it has to be considered in the context of the full basin management plan. So, the aggregate of all the uses, all the outflows, conservation, other mechanisms for generating supply from recycling to imports, whatever those might be. And this is a piece of that portfolio. And so I think that's the key context. When from the perspective of the agency, They've just got to balance their books year by year, right? For them, it's probably a little bit less important exactly which categories the income and the expenditures are in. From their perspective, the key point is balance the basin, balance the books. They have to stay in business in order to operate. So my thinking is there's room there at this point. Because we haven't done this yet, I think there's capacity. But at some point, you may hit that limit, and it may be because you simply don't have the resource available. The other issue is that, at least in the shorter term, we've got to get water levels up and quickly, right? Because in the case of basins that are subsiding or basins like this where you have seawater intrusion, we're compounding the damage year by year. And so this approach might be particularly useful for, say, a 20 or 30-year period to just try to goose the recharge, get these numbers up so that things don't get worse. And as time goes by and the basins enter sort of the glide path towards sustainability, then we can figure out how to mix the different supply options. Does that get at your question?
It's not going to be, or the opportunity is not going to be there for every basin, obviously. In
That's
the
a
case
real-
of Pajaro Valley, where they're importing water at a cost, they can reduce those costs by importing less water. That's the net benefit,
Well, yeah.
financial benefit.
Right. Here, there's no import. In the Pajaro Valley, there's zero. No imports whatsoever. So they've, for them, the next best supply is recycling, and that's expensive. They're using recycled water blended with groundwater and MAR water. And, when you look at the cost for that, it's expensive water compared to.
So their costs are in doing recharge projects or enhancing recharge.
Essentially, those are their choices. But you're absolutely right. I mean, there will be basins where this won't work. I will stipulate that from the start. But I don't think we know yet. I think we need to look around and try to find where those sweet spots are. And obviously, the first few projects might be easier in the sense of we can cherry pick those ideal locations. But just as another example, there are other techniques for getting water in the ground besides basins. There are dry wells that can penetrate shallow soils. So for example, if all the conditions are good, except it's the wrong soil type, well, a dry well might let you bypass that soil and then still percolate water in successfully. But that might require somewhat greater installation cost. Again, these are all the trade-offs that have to be taken into account. I think in a lot of ways, the biggest question for sustainability is whether you can keep building new projects without an independent revenue stream. What we're doing here is essentially writing proposals to state programs, federal programs, to try to raise costs to build the projects, but then relying on the rebates and our effort to sort of run them. And I think the big question at the end of the 5-year pilot is what kind of a business model can we come up with which would let this keep going in perpetuity? And it might involve, just as an example, it might mean a higher fraction of the augmentation fee needs to be rebated. Maybe it's not 50%, maybe it's 75%. Maybe there needs to be some other funding source like a bond measure that an agency would have in order to create the capital to build the projects, right? But then they'd have to service that bond. So that probably would require some of the rebate. Again, these are, I think it's going to vary place by place, but I think it's worth considering what some of those options might be.
Thank you.
You may have covered this, but I may have missed it. On the wood chips, what am I doing wrong here? Just me, my magnetic personality.
I'll just hold it.
On the wood chips, did you ever come to a conclusion as to why, was it specifically wood chips as to created the greater permeability or the nitrate removal because of void space of wood chips, or what's your conclusion on why that?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question had to do with the configuration of the permeable reactive barrier or wood chips that we've been using. And we've performed 2 sets of field experiments, and we have some lab studies running right now with columns where we're bringing soils from the field into the lab and then creating artificial columns and pushing water at different rates. The short answer is we don't know yet. We were a little bit surprised that we got as much denitrification as we did despite the high flow rates, because the residence time that the water spends in contact with the PRB is short. It's on the order of minutes to hours. And for comparison, in water treatment systems that use these bioreactors, they often have residence times of days to weeks, very, very long times. So, in fact, when we first ran those tests and we saw the rates of infiltration at 10 meters a day, the total rates, we just thought, we've totally missed it. We're not going to get anything. Maybe we should cancel the experiments. And we thought, let's just try it. Let's see what we get. So we were very surprised that we could get nitrogen removal at those relatively high rates. One of the things we're thinking about for this summer is mixing the soil amendment in with the soil directly. That may have benefits from a management perspective, because then the basins themselves could just be scraped out at the end. It wouldn't be a big deal. We wouldn't have a fabric to deal with or this layer of solid wood chips to deal with. The other thing we tried was with this refined charcoal called biochar, and we also saw denitrification, but in a different format, or what appears to be a different mechanism. And so we're thinking of combining those in some experiments this summer to see if that also helps to enhance it. So I think it's early days right now for this. It's intriguing that something that's essentially a waste product of lumber production could potentially be used to improve water supply. I think that's good. And the fact that wood chips work better than biochar is a win as well. We were a little concerned because biochar is a little bit expensive. Now we need to really figure out, why is it working the way it works? What is it doing that allows the microbes to be more efficient? And then how do we implement it at a field scale? And that last one, I think, is something we'll be working on. What's nice about the sites is that so far the landowners and tenants who are having us do the projects are enthusiastic about us running tests. So for example, this winter, we'll probably go out and put some trenches in and try different amendments, instrument them, figure out what works before we invest in trying to put 4 acres of wood chips out or something like that.
Well, then, the density, because I'm thinking that's got to influence all of it as well.
The thing with the wood is it's much coarser than the native soil. So the wood essentially provides no limit. The biggest issue I think we're going to have with the wood is clogging, because it's very hard to remove all the sediment. Part of what makes this area so great for farming is the loose soils, and they're very sandy. And so you just inevitably get a big sediment load with the stormwater. And so we need to be very efficient with retention of the sediment, which is also important for, downstream in general. We don't want a bunch of sediment export from the basin. But we then need to look at the maintenance issue. How do we keep the PRB going? In the ground, in PRB systems and aquifers, there's studies that have shown them denitrifying at the same rate for 10 years, and they're still going strong. It seems like there's just a ton of carbon available within those systems that helps to provide a food source for the microbes. Will that be the case here? I don't know yet. We're just not that far along. You're welcome.
I have one from online. Do you have any thoughts on using vegetation as part of the recharge basin design, particularly in restoring native habitat epidemics to the various areas? What are the benefits and the challenges in this approach?
Great question. One of our dreams early on in this work, when we started thinking about it about 10 years ago, was actually combining a constructed wetland system with an infiltration system. That was sort of our model, I think, in our minds about how this would look. And one of the challenges with areas where there's agriculture, actively farmed areas, is that growers are discouraged from having habitat on their farms. In fact, there are regulations that prohibit the creation of habitat because of worries of food safety. We had the problem a few years back with the E. coli that was traced to pigs, to feral pigs. When you have habitat, it's potentially a problem for the growers. And they fill out a lot of paperwork every year to certify they're not creating habitat. So habitat and wetlands on farmed landscapes is a challenge. However, there are other landscapes like parks, like state properties, county properties. We've been working with a group at Elkhorn Slough Foundation we've written a couple proposals, which we have not been successful with yet, on trying to get one of these systems put in one of their restoration areas. They're restoring an old farmed area that was amazing. It had 20-degree slopes. I was out there a few years back and they were still farming it, and it looked like the tractors were just going to tumble down the hill. They were so steep. And that property has now been purchased by the Elkhorn Slough Foundation, and they're replanting with native vegetation. And we wanted to put one of these systems in to track what happened to the hydrologic cycle as the landscape was converted back into native vegetation. I still think it's a good project, and we're going to keep trying to do it. I think, so the trick is to find the right spots. I think the same thing applies to one of the projects we're working on is at an airport, and we can't have open water at an airport because it attracts birds, and birds don't do well with planes. So, you don't necessarily think of these things right out of the gate, but each one of these issues has to be considered. So I'd still say it's our dream to have a project someday that combines habitat restoration with groundwater recharge. I think they go together, but we have to find the right spot in order to make that successful. Question back here?
I have a question about the incentiveness. You said that might be able to be used throughout California maybe, but excuse my ignorance, but is it normal for a water district to charge for extracting water out of the ground?
It may be much more normal in the future because the groundwater sustainability agencies that are being formed need to come up with a revenue stream. In order for them to operate, they have to charge something. So in some ways, Pajaro Valley Water is one mechanism. That's one approach you could take. You could tie the fees that are charged to water use, so to pumping. There could be a flat fee. There could be a fee by parcel size. There could be a fee by crop type. There are many different models. But the GSAs have to have a funding stream. They will not function without it. So historically, it has not been the standard. 50 years from now, it might be a lot more common. And we're kind of in this funny place right now where Sigma is just taking off and GSAs are forming and plans are being put together, and those plans will include revenue. They'll include how they're going to operate. So, I think it's hard to impose fees, impose taxes, but it might be somewhat easier if there's a fee structure and there's a rebate structure at the same time.
I just got another one from online. What are the potential impacts of these stormwater recharge programs to downstream water right holders? And does this require any permit application from the State Water Board Water Right Division?
Yeah, another great question. And the short answer is yes. There can be situations where the diversion of water creates a water rights conflict. We've been focused on hill slopes before water reaches a blue line stream. And in part, it's specifically to minimize this impact. In individual cases, this is going to have to be assessed. And there certainly are permit issues. At one project site, there is an endemic species that requires a permit. And at other sites, there are permits or agreements required from various local, state, or potentially federal agencies. And the only way we've been able to run these projects is in collaboration with the water agency and then the Resource Conservation District of Santa Cruz County, who are, this is what they do for a living, is they help to identify the permit requirements and then help to navigate the administrative tasks that have to be accomplished. What I'd say is that I think there's always the potential for water rights to be an issue. I think this approach probably minimizes those effects compared to many other approaches, but it doesn't mean that it's free of all possible issues with rights. And as far as permitting, we are subject to all of the same requirements as any other project. Good question. Well, I'll be here for a little while longer if you have more questions, and I've got cards, and you're welcome to contact me, and I can provide reprints or copies of documents if you might be interested. If there are particular topics you're interested in, I'll try to supply that information to you. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.